Okay guys, I keep mismanaging my camera. I ran into both the filling up the data card and also the camera was running out of battery. This camera doesn't allow you to plug it in, so you can only go on the battery and I have to charge it. I need to figure out exactly how much time. I think like somewhere around an hour and 15-20 minutes is what I can do, and I keep going over that. Okay, I'm just so close to finishing this little section on the results associated with the Spanish-American War that I just want to finish real quickly, okay, before we move on. I was telling you guys about the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment is one of those activities of the United States, policy statement of the United States, which will allow the Americans to establish hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And I told you that the Platt Amendment was required because the Americans had proclaimed that they would not annex Cuba in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. Teller Amendment said that there would be no annexation, classic statement of idealism, but the Americans still wanted to control Cuba. So the Platt Amendment essentially became a manifestation of what we call neo-colonialism. So that means, this is having a colony without actually calling it a colony. And instead, Cuba became what the Americans will describe, as the Platt Amendment describes, as a protectorate. And of course, to protect someone, you have to control them. So the Americans are going to move to control Cuba. And I told you that they would move to control the economy. The Cubans could have no foreign loans without American approval. They said they were going to control the foreign policy. Cuba could make no treaty without American approval, which basically means the Americans are controlling their foreign policy. And I think the final thing I was telling you guys, that the United States will proclaim for itself full military intervention, which meant that if there was any problem in Cuba, the United States military would come. And indeed, the United States military was basically a permanent occupant of Cuba through the early part of the 20th century. Indeed, although the United States would not annex Cuba, it would annex a part of Cuba, and it would annex this location called Guantanamo Bay. And this is today the infamous Gitmo, of course, where the perpetrators of 9/11 are still sort of left there in purgatory, one way or the other, have no idea what's going to happen to them. It's extremely interesting, of course, because this is an American military facility that is in a communist country. It's in communist Cuba. But of course, the Cubans can't do a damn thing about it. In fact, the United States has often wanted them to try to do something about it. It would give the United States pretext, of course, for invasion or to overcoming Cuba. I don't want you to think that everything, so when the Americans are going to dominate Cuba, in no uncertain terms, through the first decades of the 20th century. And I don't want you to think this was all bad for Cuba. The United States will stimulate the Cuban economy by buying their sugar again. The United States will build a railroad system for Cuba. The United States will introduce the first public schooling for Cuba. The United States will send Dr. Walter Reed, down to Cuba to try to deal with the issue of malaria and yellow fever. And although, of course, Dr. Reed and no one else can find a cure for malaria and yellow fever, he found the vector. So it was Dr. Walter Reed who identified that it was mosquitoes, of course, that are the vector of malaria. And so the United States began to embark upon massive mosquito eradication programs, which of course was for their own benefit, but also will very much benefit the well-being of the people who lived in Cuba. It was in some ways good for Cuba, but the Cubans also felt that they were used, that they were dominated, they were manipulated. And so over time there began to be an increased anti-American feeling as far as Cuba was concerned. And I think that's the only way you can explain Castro and communist Cuba. I mean, Castro will step forward as a sort of anti-American hero and become the hero of Cuba. And, not all Cubans like that, of course. There are many Cubans who leave as Castro steps in, but the Cubans were willing to accept the problems of their society, where they drive around in cars from the 1950s, even into the 21st century, basically, and of course the depredations against their economy, because they resented the fact that the Americans had been so dominating, at least in the earlier part of the 20th century. But the Platt Amendment is policy step number one to begin to move towards this position of relative hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. The second major enactment was the Roosevelt Corollary of 1904. And the Roosevelt Corollary, what it would do is it extended the idea of American hegemony not just to Cuba, but to the entire area of the Western Hemisphere, and actually to the area of Latin America. One thing that's just interesting about all the activities of the United States government is that they tended to pretty much ignore Canada. Canada was still part of the purview of the British Empire, and of course the Americans couldn't necessarily mess with that. But everything to the south of the United States is the area, and of course even Canada would have come under the sway, if anything, important happened up there. But the Roosevelt Corollary will extend American hegemony throughout most of the Western Hemisphere, especially the general area of Latin America. Now, the word corollary has a particular meaning, and the word corollary means a logical addition or addendum. So you must be corollary to something else. You're adding it on to something else. And the Roosevelt Corollary, which is a potential identification, of course, in the context of the rise to world power, is a logical addition or addendum to the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine was passed in 1823 by President Monroe. This was America's first great policy statement, the first time they ever did it. And what was happening at this time was that almost all of the areas of Latin America and generally the Western Hemisphere were becoming independent at that time. So the United States of America, even though not terribly powerful, made this very bold statement. And the Monroe Doctrine says that the United States would allow no further colonization of the New World. No further colonization. So that means no one can come and try to retake the areas of the New World area, you know, the French, the Spanish, the British. No one can retake any of these areas. So this is an American demand to the world saying you cannot colonize the New World area. Now, the reality is that the United States was not powerful enough to enforce this. You know, this is a relatively small, not so terribly powerful country in 1823. But the good news was the British government thought this was a good idea. So it's long been said that the British Navy enforced the Monroe Doctrine, at least for the first 70 or so years, you know, almost 80 years, until the United States could kind of take it over. And at this moment, the United States indeed is taking it over, right? So what the Roosevelt Corollary is, it's an addendum, logical addendum, addition or addendum to the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine said that the United States would allow no further colonization of the New World. What the Roosevelt Corollary is going to build upon that kind of notion. At this time, there was the potential of sort of European activities in the Western Hemisphere. So just one of the famous stories or infamous stories of that moment. Venezuela had borrowed a tremendous amount of money from European banks, primarily from the British, from the French banks, and from German banks. And Venezuela had defaulted on their loans. They were unable to pay their loans back. And so, you know, those banks in those countries turned to their governments to try to get their governments to force Venezuela to pay the money back. And the British and the French were willing to use diplomatic measures. They were simply going to try to put pressure upon the people of Venezuela. But the Germans decided to send destroyers to Venezuela. So they sent naval vessels to Venezuela to point their guns at the Venezuelans and say, you know, pay us our money back, damn it. Now, the United States did not like that. They didn't like that one bit, basically. So this is kind of the motivating factor behind the Roosevelt Corollary. And what the Roosevelt Corollary says, not only will we not allow further colonization, the United States would not allow any interference whatsoever, any external interference whatsoever. So the United States basically establishes itself as the protector of the entire realm of the Western Hemisphere. And I have to let you guys know, this is still in place. If anyone comes into the Western Hemisphere and tries to do anything that we don't want them to do, we are going to respond to that in a very, very active kind of way, very aggressive kind of way. So this is simply a proclamation. And in some ways you could, so that's good, right? That means that Chile and other South American countries and Mexico, they don't have to worry about any foreign interference that would come, of course, from across the Atlantic Ocean. However, and I should say but, okay? And this is the big but of the Roosevelt Corollary, and I am not talking about William Howard Taft now, okay? But the big but, there should be some ellipses right there, the big but of the Roosevelt Corollary is that while the United States would allow no outside interference, it proclaimed for itself full rights of military intervention. So that means that if the United States thought that there was a problem in any country, especially in Latin America, they felt that they were allowed to then interfere in that. In the language of the actual corollary, it says the United States could respond to any chronic wrongdoing or economic malfeasance. And so those are broadly defined areas. So any chronic wrong, if the country's doing something wrong, at least in the interpretation of the United States, if there is significant economic malfeasance and they're doing something wrong, not paying their loans or whatever, the United States will proclaim itself, of course, able to deal with that, to confront that particular issue. Now, I do want you guys to know these were not just words; it became a reality. And during the first part of the 20th century, the United States will begin to intervene in the affairs of numerous South American states. I mean, this was a phenomenon of the first part of the 20th century. And so the question almost is, not what countries the United States did interfere with. The question is what countries did the United States not interfere with. I don't think they messed with Brazil. I may be wrong. I don't think Argentina. I don't think Chile. But so many other countries are going to, tragically, it's getting dark here and the map's not going to be that good for us. But the United States will interfere in the affairs of Colombia, will interfere in the affairs of Venezuela, interfere in the affairs of Panama. In fact, Panama was basically a creature of the United States. We took that from Colombia so we could build finish the canal, we could build the canal across Panama. We'll interfere in the affairs of Haiti, we'll interfere in the affairs of Santo Domingo, of course, involved in the activities of Cuba, Costa Rica, Nicaragua. For 30 years, the Americans were a military presence in Nicaragua, which of course is a foundation of tremendous amounts of kind of animosity on the part of future Nicaraguans who remembered that time when the United States. And what we would do is the Marines would hit the beach. Of course, they would routinely take over the political apparatus, the economic apparatus, and then the United States would reshape it again, often in the interest of the United States, and not necessarily in the interest, of course, of the people, especially the common people of South America. One of the most notorious activities, of course, just from the perspective of our neighbor, is the United States will do the same thing to Mexico. Twice in the early 20th century, the United States will invade into Mexico. The first was in 1911. There's a revolution in Mexico. The Americans are not happy with the way it is all proceeding, basically, and so the United States decides to invade, and they go to Veracruz. Veracruz is the great East Coast port as far as Mexico is concerned, and just seized it, basically, telling the Mexicans, you need to fix this situation. So Americans just going down there and seizing it. Later on, there will be an invasion in the northern part of Mexico, to a degree in a response to a problem. Pancho Villa, of course, that extraordinary revolutionary bandito individual with the, going around with a double bullet belt. That's such a macho look, of course, the double bullet belt look across your chest. I've always wanted to dress up like that for Halloween, but I was worried that might irritate my skin or something like that. Anyway, Pancho Villa did periodically invade across into, let's say, New Mexico for supplies and things like that. And the United States decided that this was inappropriate, and of course it is true, inappropriate. So the United States will send Blackjack Pershing with an American army to invade into the northern part of Mexico, basically to hunt down and find, of course, Pancho Villa. And so just an American military force enters into Mexico, and this is 1916, and is just roaming around the entire area, of course. Intriguingly, they did not find Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa was able to stay away from them. Part of the story here is, that Pancho Villa had this extraordinary horse, and the horse his name was La Cucaracha, which I guess means the cockroach. And of course, there will be a Mexican folk song that is oriented this, La Cucaracha, La Cucaracha. I can't remember the rest of the song. Anyway, there's this one verse of La Cucaracha which is intriguing. So it's about this horse, kind of famous horse. But the verse goes, La Cucaracha es muy triste porque no tiene marihuana por fumar. And if you interpret that, I think that means that the horse is unhappy because it doesn't have marijuana to smoke. And I have no idea how a horse would ever smoke marijuana. Would they put a doobie in the roach clip, or roach clip in the bridle or something like that? I have no idea. But apparently La Cucaracha was able, no matter what its marijuana smoking habits were, to keep Pancho Villa from ever being captured by the Americans. Anyway, all of this, though, it shows the United States is not just proclaiming that they are in charge of the Western Hemisphere. They're acting upon it in a major way, even invading and taking over Latin American countries. And of course, over time, this will have a result, an increased animosity. Those who lived in South America, for those who lived south of the border, the Americans seemed like this really big, northern power that could do pretty much whatever they wanted to, and they would descend upon you just because they thought it was the right thing to do. And of course, over time, this does indeed begin to create animosity on the part of those who live south of the border. So you might begin to see signs on the walls, where the Americans were intervening, something like this: "Yankee, go home." And of course, you guys know that that's not the way that you would spell Yankee in terms of the United States of America, but that would be a Spanish version of it, but just suggesting the fact that there was a tremendous amount of resentment on the part of the Latin Americans towards, of course, the United States. But of course, both these things, the Platt Amendment, the Roosevelt Corollary, they are powerful indications of America's rise to world power. So the Spanish-American War, what it will do, it will expand the realm of the United States of America to become dominant in the entire Western Hemispheric area, and also in the Pacific, of course, reaching all the way to the Philippines. And ironically, again, the Americans, those who were still promoting the concept of isolationism would say, well, that's okay, just expanding the boundary of the isolation. So the United States, their realm is isolated to the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific Rim, which is basically half of the entire globe. But they still retain this notion, of course, that isolationism was the way to go. Well, the Spanish-American War is step number one on the road to America's rise to power. Step number two, a much larger issue that will bring the Americans onto the doorstep of global power, not just hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, but hegemony in the entire world, of course. That's going to be World War II. And I'm going to take my break here. I'll come back tomorrow and I'm going to do World War II, World War I. If I said World War II, I forget. World War I, we'll talk about World War I tomorrow. Okay, so you guys have a nice evening.